because we do our actual buyer persona research. We study the heck out of their biggest goals and their biggest challenges in their own words. We do surveys, we look at their search and social footprint, we interview them in person, by video, whatever works, but we need to get consensus on their 5, 10, 15 biggest things, biggest topics, biggest goals, biggest challenges that are top of mind, front burner for them right now. And then once we know, let's say, for example, you uncover 6 big goals and 6 big challenges for each of your buyer personas. Let's say, for argument's sake, your primary buyer persona is a CTO of a mid-sized manufacturing or healthcare company, and your secondary buyer persona maybe is the owner of a managed service provider. Welcome to the Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show. I'm Joshua Feinberg from DCSMI, and we're thrilled to have you with us this week. Each week on this live show, I address a handful of the biggest sales and marketing challenges that we're hearing about from all over the data center ecosystem. This includes data center operators like hyperscalers, colocation providers, edge, modular, wholesale data center providers, as well as technology and facilities related companies that sell to and partner with the data center operators and enterprise data centers, as well as data center construction, real estate, and investment companies that are all in on data centers, critical facilities, and digital infrastructure, plus all of the various different kinds of outsourced sales and marketing related companies in and around the data center ecosystem. And this show is for you regardless of where you sit on the go-to-market, on the GTM team. Perhaps you work in a sales related role, maybe you're an account executive, sales development or business development rep, perhaps you're an account manager, maybe you work in some kind of marketing capacity or product capacity or channel partnerships, or perhaps you are the executive sponsor, the leader, the orchestra conductor, the one who's responsible for getting the right people in the right seats on the bus, in the right places on the boat, rowing at the same speed, playing the instruments at the right time, at the right tempo, in perfect harmony, and perfect alignment, perfect collaboration to enable your company to do amazing work in and around this period of terrific growth in and around data centers, digital infrastructure, and critical facilities. If you want to make sure that you stay in the loop on upcoming events and educational resources just like this, make sure that you're subscribed to our data center sales and marketing newsletter from DCSMI that comes to your email inbox on Sundays. You can subscribe for free directly on our website at www.dcsmi.com. So what is on the agenda for this week? First, we're going to look at how a leading colocation and hybrid cloud provider generates data center leads. After that, we'll turn our attention to how a colocation, cloud services, and network connectivity company generates demand. Then we'll shift over to look at a part of the facilities part of the data center ecosystem, and in particular, how to grow a data center cooling business in a new regional market. Then we'll take a real quick break for a message from our sponsor. And in the second half of this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show, we'll talk about how a data center general contractor generates customers for future project scope. That's in the construction, real estate, and investment part of the data center ecosystem. Next, we'll talk about how a data center efficiency, reliability, and sustainability firm can sell solutions and optimize costs. That would be a company in professional services working in the facilities part of the data center ecosystem. And as we head down the home stretch on this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show, we'll also talk about how to grow a data center infrastructure and cloud solutions business. If you have an idea for a topic or a question or a challenge that you're trying to work through in your own business, on your team, either individually, as your team, as a company, and you'd like us to address this sales and marketing challenge in an upcoming episode of this show, be sure to leave that in the comments on whatever platform you're watching on, and we will add that to the consideration queue for an upcoming episode. So without any further delay, let's jump into this week's first question. So how does a leading colocation and hybrid cloud provider generate data center leads? So your business is principally there to provide colocation services, colocation space, as well as hybrid cloud solutions. And you're wondering how you can generate leads for these kinds of clients. So, as a colocation operator and hybrid cloud provider, you are a data center operator. You're not a technology company necessarily, although you could be providing a lot of IT services. You're not specializing in facilities, although you certainly own your own facilities. You're not specializing in construction, although at some point the facility had to get built and commissioned, right? And you're not specializing in outsourced sales and marketing. So clearly your principal business is being a data center operator, selling space, power, compute, storage, bandwidth to typically multi-tenants, multiple companies in your particular facility. In addition to that, you're also providing hybrid cloud services, which usually means that it's a mix of premise and off-premise. So in other words, clients have their servers in your facilities, in addition to also using, usually it's private cloud, but it could also be public cloud. It could be multi-cloud. You could be orchestrating a lot of different cloud, but typically hybrid just means that in addition to the colocation, that there's some data that's being shifted in and out of the cloud that needs to be coordinated with that. Now, some colocation operators that provide strong competitive advantage set up these direct connections to the major hyperscale cloud providers like Microsoft Azure, Amazon Web Services, and Google Cloud. And that certainly makes it easier, makes it faster, makes it more direct, as the name implies, for their clients to get access to those public cloud resources. So when it comes to that line of business, how are you going to generate leads? I think it's largely a matter of understanding where you've historically done best. Who are your best clients? Who are your most profitable clients? Who are your happiest clients? And usually when it comes to a company that's providing colo and hybrid cloud, there's logos on your website for your happiest clients. There's testimonials, there's case studies, there's reviews. All of that give us an idea as to where you've been most successful. In addition to that, there's likely some clues when you go into your CRM, your customer relationship management system. There's also for sure some clues when you talk to your finance leaders about who are the most profitable clients. There's definitely some clues when you talk to your account managers, your client success folks as to who's the happiest, who tends to expand the most, who provides the most positive word of mouth, who consistently has the highest net promoter scores, a host of related metrics that help to give you clarity on where you should be looking for more leads. So once you have that figured out, you'll be able to document your ideal client profile so you know geographically where these clients tend to be located, how big or small these companies are, typically for a colocation provider, depending on what your entry level minimums are, that will define the minimum size that they need to be. Like, for example, if you're only selling full cabinets, well, that's a larger, medium-sized business typically than a small startup-y kind of business. If you're looking to lease an anchor tenant, that's more large colo getting into the world of wholesale. In some cases, that would be the other extreme. That's a very large company with thousands and thousands. So over time, depending on your available space, depending on your company's resources, where you can land and expand, where you can win and retain the best clients, you should get strong clarity on the range of size that these companies are that would be a great fit for leads. In other words, maybe it's companies that have at least 50 employees up to 5,000 employees, or maybe it's 10 employees up to 500 employees. Again, this will depend on where you've historically had the most success, who's the happiest, who is the best onboarding, who stays the longest, who's the most profitable, all that good stuff. And then in addition, when it comes to colocation on hybrid cloud, in the technology and the digital infrastructure, many times in geographic regions, there's certain kind of industries that require certain kinds of compliance, certain accreditation, certain certifications. So either you have those or you don't. If in your particular region you have SOC or HIPAA or PCI or whatever it is that's relevant for where you're doing business, great. That will help you figure out some industries that are a great fit. Along the same lines, if you're doing business in one or more geographic areas where you know there's certain kind of accreditations that you don't have, that may eliminate from the consideration set certain kinds of industries. So you'd want to also document those in your ideal client profile so you know to basically exclude them. So your outbound campaign, any ads that you run where you can target by industry, your drop-down lists on your web forms, how you filter, how you set up lists in your CRM, how you do your email marketing. All of those benefit from not only knowing the specific industries that are a great fit for your colo and hybrid cloud, but which industries you're just not going to be able to work with right now based on your company's current capabilities. So that's your ideal client profile. From there, you should be able to build out a target account list, usually a couple hundred for this kind of business, depending on how many locations you have. It could be a couple thousand if it's a really, really targeted type of outreach. It may be just a few dozen. Usually when you get to that small of a list, you're dealing more with hyperscale than with colocation. But yeah, it's the basic idea. Once you have your ideal client profile, you'll be able to build that target account list. And depending on how your sales team or sales teams are organized, you may decide to allocate certain named accounts to certain reps based on their industry expertise, based on their comfort level and expertise of being able to close certain deal sizes, or a combination of the two. You might also decide that one of your target segments is channel partners, like managed service providers or integrators or VARs. That's certainly a very, very popular secondary or tertiary buyer persona for a lot of colocation operators and hybrid cloud providers. So if that's the case, you'll also likely segment by whether a particular account executive, whether a particular SDR or BDR is working with direct accounts in certain industries, direct accounts of certain sizes in terms of their headcount or number of employees, which would usually map to how much space and power they potentially need in your facility. And then you may have a whole separate team, so a whole separate structure for your channel partners, because that's a very different kind of go-to-market playbook than a direct playbook. When it comes to colocation on hybrid cloud as well, usually when it comes to your lead generation, you'll also want to think about what percentage of your investment is going to go to clients that are located in extreme proximity to your facilities, and what percentage of your resources is going to go to long distance sales and marketing. So by local proximity, when we've looked at all the data over the years, and this validated recently, it's been going on for literally decades, CTOs and clients that tend to be interested in colocation usually want colocation facilities that are really, really close by to where they work or live, usually a few miles. Because of that, by the nature of that preference, there's a strong need for you to run a hyper-local playbook for each of your colocation facilities. What that means is running lead generation for companies, for individuals within those companies that are, say, within a 30 or 60 minute drive of your location. Because if they're much beyond that, it's pretty far-fetched that you're going to be at the top of their list. Now, in terms of who these people should be within these accounts, we'll get to that in a moment. So that's at a high level, the hyper-local playbook. So that hyper-local playbook may center around inviting people from your target accounts to come visit your facility, not really just for a tour. Of course, that's always interesting and a key part of the sales process in most cases for definitely for colo, a lot of times for hybrid cloud as well. But we don't want them to just visit for tours. We want them to come and learn with your team. Why is that so important? Because we now live in a world where self-driven buyers' journeys have become the predominant way that people research and make purchase decisions around colocation and hybrid cloud. What does this mean? Well, 10 years ago, it was very likely that your colocation and hybrid cloud buyers would get about halfway through their research and decision making, and they'd be ready to meet with someone from your sales team. 10 years ago, CEB, the corporate executive board that's now owned by Gartner, found that 56% of a typical buyer's journey was over before vendor contact or sales contact. So that wasn't too bad. So if you did everything right, you were still in there for the final 44% of the buyer's journey. However, the last 10 years has been really, really transformative, is one way to say it. There's been huge changes, not only in the nature of colocation and hybrid cloud. We know all the power requirements and density requirements that are driving liquid cooling with AI and high performance computing and supercomputing. But in addition to that, your buyers have also quite dramatically changed how they make purchase decisions around colo and hybrid cloud. That 56% point is now very much a point of nostalgia in the rearview mirror. Today, you can count on that a minimum of 83% of their research and decision making happens without you in the room. 83%. They're going to get 83% of the way through their research and decision making process before they're willing to meet with someone from your sales team. So even if you do everything perfectly, running an exquisite playbook, you're only in there for the final 17%. And wow, is that super challenging for people that are clinging to an outdated legacy sales and marketing playbook from 10 years ago. By the way, that 83% point is from Gartner. 83%, Gartner found 83% of researching, comparing options and evaluating pricing now happens before vendor contact. So what are you going to do if you're only in there for the final 17%? You're totally being ghosted, eliminated, ignored for the first 83%. Fear not, there actually is a way for you to get back in there and party like it's still 10 years ago or 20 years ago. How do you do this? We lean into the fact that even in a self-driven buyer's journey, your most important buyer personas still need to learn. They're still all in on professional development, keeping their skills sharp, learning and development. So what we need to do is when we understand in these target accounts who the most important people are that we need to be building relationships with, we study the heck out of them. We understand what's going on in their world. And we need to figure out a way for your client-facing team members to reposition themselves away from their traditional titles that are basically people are now sales allergic to, and instead to invite these same prospects, invite these same clients to educational events where they can learn together in such a way that your account executives, your sales development reps, your marketers, your product managers, your channel partnership managers are now no longer seen by those old-fashioned dusty titles, but instead are seen more like teachers, consultants, subject matter experts, trusted advisors, perhaps even thought leaders. This is incredibly important for you to earn your way back in the first 83% of the buyer's journey. So you can have significant surface area in those 28 touch points between complete stranger and purchase decision, especially in the awareness and the consideration stages of the buyer's journey. So how do we know what these educational events should be about, regardless of whether we're talking about in-person events like breakfast seminars, lunch and learns, mini conferences, or something like that, which could be held right in your own classroom, in your own conference room, in your foyer. Hey, if you have a place in your facility where you can comfortably seat 10, 15, 20 people, this is a fantastic playbook that costs almost nothing to run and can have a massive, massive impact on getting your ideal clients to spend more time with you, learning together, growing together. How do we know what to talk about? Because we do our actual buyer persona research. We study the heck out of their biggest goals and their biggest challenges in their own words. We do surveys, we look at their social search and social footprint, we interview them in person, by video, whatever works, but we need to get consensus on their 5, 10, 15 biggest things, biggest topics, biggest goals, biggest challenges that are top of mind, front burner for them right now. And then once we know, let's say, for example, you uncover 6 big goals and 6 big challenges for each of your buyer personas. Let's say, for argument's sake, your primary buyer persona is a CTO of a mid-size manufacturing or healthcare company, and your secondary buyer persona maybe is the owner of a managed service provider. So we need to know for those 2 different segments, what are the 5 or 6 biggest goals and the 5 or 6 biggest challenges that are top of mind, the consensus for that particular segment. And once we know those 5 or 6 goals, and once we know those 5 or 6 challenges, we have 10 or 12 ideas for what our topic should be once a month, every single month, like clockwork, for our educational events. If those CTOs and their team members are close enough that they can drive to your facility, these should be in-person events. If they're not close enough that they can drive to your facility, well, at the risk of getting a little meta, they're going to look like webinars, they're going to look like virtual events, they're going to look like live streams, and you can certainly do both. We know that even with perfectly, flawlessly executed playbook, say your conference room, your classroom holds 18 people. We know that there's going to be multiple coworkers, other stakeholders from these same companies who should have been in the room that weren't there. So you for sure can record those. For sure, you can also offer them on demand. For sure, you can also offer those virtually to CTOs at similar manufacturing and healthcare companies that are not conveniently able to drive to your particular location, or MSPs. Now, the question is, should the CTOs and the MSPs be at the same event? If that's the only way you're going to get this done, maybe, but a much better way to do this is to have a separate event series for each of your most important segments, because they care about completely different issues. They talk about completely different topics. They have completely different pain. And in order for us to be tuned into growing these leads and nurturing these leads, one huge thing that we're looking for is for these events to be so valuable that the people that register want to bring their coworkers along with them. This is really, really important. So when someone registers for one of your in-person events or virtual events, they should be getting back an email that says, hey, we're so glad to see that you registered for our upcoming breakfast seminar on cybersecurity best practices for mid-market IT executives in the greater whatever region. But we know when it comes to cybersecurity, it truly takes a village. Typically, IT professionals, operations, support, engineering, finance, compliance, it takes a village. So with that in mind, who else should also be joining us for this event? Simply hit the forward button on your email, add a thought or two on why this matters. And we know that teams that learn together grow together. When this is working, you start to notice multiple people registering from the same company and attending from the same company. And the awesome part about this is you're driving alignment in the awareness and the consideration stages of the buyer's journey. What that means, you are able to proactively school these folks on your best practices and your methodologies at a point in their buyer's journey where they're open to learning. This is incredibly important. If you think about how kids grow into adults, what do we call that period in between childhood and adulthood? Adolescence, right? What a lot of people refer to adolescence is those are the formative years, right? So the formative middle stages of the buyer's journey gives you a really unique opportunity to be able to educate and build trust with one or more stakeholders from each of your target accounts in a way that shows them the advantages of your way of approaching colocation and hybrid cloud. Now, if you're unable to get in early and you're unable to get in often, but you manage to meet someone all the way at the tail end of their buyer's journey, you may think that, oh, well, that's good. Well, not so much, because by the time they get to you, someone else, probably a competitor, a direct or an indirect competitor, maybe a non-business model competitor, is the one that's controlling that learning and development and professional development. Your goal going forward, if you want to get your sales team back in there early and often in a way that they can truly make impact, in a way that those buyers are not going to get from interacting with a digital tool, it's incredibly important that your prospects and clients see your client-facing team members as teachers, consultants, subject matter experts, and trusted advisors. Now, this changes the nature of who you hire. It changes the nature of how you invest in your own team members, upskilling, reskilling, and cross-training. But at the absolute minimum, this should change the conversation internally to be focused on getting your subject matter experts aligned around being able to present your company's expertise as the be-all end-all expert, the top go-to experts in your particular region where your facilities are, for specific size companies and specific kinds of industries and specific kinds of stakeholders in those accounts. And when it's that hyper specific, it becomes a lot more differentiated. And that's what we're talking about here, is we're trying to get you out of the commoditization. We're trying to get you out of the commodity broker business with colo and hybrid cloud. Because at this point in time, if you're not bringing deep expertise for specific kinds of companies in specific kind of regions and building your company brand and professional brand like this, it's going to be a really, really tough haul. We saw the exact same thing happen 10 years ago in the web hosting business, as it went from being a healthy business to being a commoditized business. In a lot of ways, the same thing is happening in the low end part of colocation and hybrid cloud. The playbook that we're talking about here today is your way to build a moat and protect and build your brand in a way that helps you stand out in crowded marketplaces and get your sales team back in early and often to generate leads where you're simultaneously educating and building trust. Now they've come into your facility, they have a little bit of networking and some breakfast or lunch before the talk. You teach for 30 or 45 minutes, you answer some questions, you take them on a tour around your facility and lather, rinse, and repeat. You'd be amazed. That simple process, once a month like clockwork for in-person events, virtual events. Obviously for virtual events, it's going to be tough to feed them. There was a lot of people that experimented during the pandemic with sending gift cards. That's pros and cons with that, but they're trying to learn. And the better job you can do with sharing best practices and insights that help them do their job better, that help their team achieve a goal, close a gap on a major challenge that's driving them nuts, help their company, the more they're going to want to spend time with your client-facing team members, the more they're going to want to bring their coworkers, their colleagues, their boss along with them to this particular learning and development, professional development format. And it becomes a very, very natural thing for them to be spending so much time with you that you're not only guaranteed to stay on the short list, these kinds of investments end up knocking your competitors off of the short list. So by the time they're ready for a sales conversation, in a lot of cases, the short list has become one company, your company, and the price sensitivity is largely gone because they've learned so much from you. And they've realized that there's no one else in town, no one else in the region that can hold a candle to the expertise that you bring to the table with your internal client-facing team members and perhaps some of your external channel partners who are out on these educational events as well. So that's my insights. That's my strategy for and thoughts for what a leading colo and hybrid cloud provider should be doing to generate great data center leads. Okay, what do we have up next? How does a colocation, cloud services, and network connectivity company generate demand? How does a company that's in the business of colocation, cloud services, and network connectivity generate demand? So as we get into 3 different lines of business here, for starters, with colocation and cloud and network connectivity, we're now in 2 different parts of the data center ecosystem. Colocation and cloud services is, for all intents and purposes, being in the data center operator business. Cloud services, in some ways, when you look at the hyperscalers providing massive amounts of cloud services, that's like a hyperscale data center, but it is possible to provide cloud services on a small scale in colocation or even in edge facilities. Usually it's colocation. So we're talking about being a data center operator and network connectivity. So the question is network connectivity. Are you just talking about like the cross connects, the connectivity within the data center, or are you talking about taking a very active role in telecommunications, in between the servers, between the racks and your meet me room? So we start getting into peering, IXs, carrier neutrality. And when you start getting into peering, IXs, carrier neutrality, meet me rooms, we get into being a telecommunications provider. And a telecommunications provider is in the technology part of the data center ecosystem. So in addition to having business interests as a data center operator, you're also going to have business interests as being a technology provider. So the question is, how comprehensively are you involved in network connectivity? Are you just involved on this particular side? Are you involved on selling the whole circuit? At what point do you what's your point of demarcation? In other words, if they are going data center to data center, how much are you actively going to be involved in supporting that? And if they're in an office, traditional office environment. So there's a technology services part of the business, and there is the colocation and cloud services part of the business. So what this means is, will you allow clients to cherry pick you? In other words, can they bring their own telecommunications circuits? That's the definition of carrier neutrality, right? Can they bring their own cloud services and get hooked up into your facility through like a direct connect or something like that? And can they just buy colocation? Or do you bundle this all together? And are you requiring that they basically buy your full menu of services? And these are strategy, like product management kind of decisions that hopefully you're making proactively as opposed to just flying by the seat of your pants. But what this could open up is that there is either one kind client, two different kinds of client, potentially three different kinds of clients. In other words, will you sell cloud services a la carte? Will you sell network connectivity a la carte? Will you sell colocation a la carte, or only bundled? And there's obviously quite a few permutations and combinations. What's a 2 to the third power, 8 different potential directions you can go with this. The simplest playbook for generating demand when it comes to go to market is that most of your clients are going to buy all three of these services. It's a reasonable assumption because if you look at the history of IT services businesses going back decades, managed service providers, value-added resellers, network integrators, IT consultants, small and medium-sized business owners love the single point of contact. Anything and everything having to do with their IT needs without people passing the buck, without people bouncing them around from person to person, without having to have a dozen different logons, a dozen different billing contacts, a dozen different headaches to potentially deal with no one snapping and integrating and cooperating with each other. So there's a lot to be said for their getting that single integrated solution. If there wasn't a strong preference around integrating solution in the era that we're in, you wouldn't see the runaway success of suites like Microsoft Office and Google Workspace. You'd still be like it was 30 years ago. You'd still be having people buying word processing and spreadsheet and presentation software and database software completely separate as opposed to all-in-one kinds of solutions. So if you're providing not just co-location space, the real estate, and you're truly in the IT services or the managed services business, it's very likely that this is all the same kind of ideal client profile. And it's very likely it's the same kind of set of buyer persona. So the ideal client profile defines a couple of different parameters, a couple of different specs or details on who your ideal companies are, who the ideal accounts are that you want to be selling to. Usually for a company that's providing colo cloud services and network connectivity, there's a geographic part of it. There's a company size, how big or small they are. And then there's certain industries that you'd love to be doing business with and others that are like you want to stay away from with because they're just kind of toxic accounts, or at least they're not a good fit for where you excel. So you have that ideal client profile defined. And then within those accounts, who are the key people that you want to be building relationships with? And depending on how big or small your company is and how big or small their company is, either the buyer personas are very finely tuned, very precise on certain kinds of job roles. If you're selling into enterprise, and you may need a lot more buyer personas, a lot more granular segmentation strategy. If you're selling to small and medium-sized businesses where one person wears a lot of different hats, then fewer buyer personas, a simpler go-to-market playbook, a less finely tuned, a less complicated sales playbook, a less complicated set of deal stages in your CRM. So if you're somewhere in between, if you're selling more mid-market, it's very likely that you end up with 2 or 3 different kinds of buyer personas for the ideal companies that you're selling into. For this kind of business, it's very likely that you have a channel partner buyer persona. And when it comes to generating demand, in order for us to earn our way back in a world that's increasingly allergic to sales teams, we have to figure out a way that we can provide value to these prospects, to these future clients, long before their purchase decision. This is really, really important, because regardless of whether you're talking about small business owners, IT executives, operations, infrastructure, engineering, channel partners, people have gotten so used to self-service right now, getting everything exactly what they want, when they want, 100% on their own terms, that it's increasingly really, really hard for traditional sales development reps and account executives to get in early enough to be able to shape the criteria that they use. And if your sales professionals have been at this a while, meaning they've been in this business for at least a decade, they probably remember a time when it was a lot easier. But progress We've moved forward. We moved to the point where now most of the journey is over before traditional sales professionals get to meet their prospects. So we need to figure out a way to be a lot more creative about getting in there early and often, earning a seat on their side of the table, so they truly see your team members as trusted advisors. This is incredibly important because in order to get the inside scoop on what they really need when it comes to colo, when it comes to cloud services, when it comes to network connectivity, a lot of times there's got to be a significant amount of trust between your client-facing team members and their stakeholders internally. And it's really tough to establish that kind of trust if they don't see your client-facing team members as peers, as folks that can provide a lot of value. What does that value look like? Well, when your client-facing team members are specializing by company size or specializing by certain kinds of industries, they'll start to see pattern recognition where when they talk to the CTO of a mid-market healthcare company in your region, they largely know about the 4 or 5 biggest goals that CTO, that IT executive is trying to achieve, and the 4 or 5 or 6 biggest frustrations that executive and their team are going through right now. And being able to potentially share strategies that these teams, that these companies, that the executives can use to close the gaps on some of the goals that they need to achieve and some of the frustrations that are driving them nuts right now, your client-facing team members can provide a ton of value on best practices for how other execs in similar companies in their regions of similar sizes are addressing that. So that alone is an incredibly valuable playbook. This isn't new. This has been around for the better part of 10 years. There was a best-selling business book in the early 2010s called The Challenger Sale that lays out this whole framework. Is it's not enough to just answer their questions. We need to proactively understand the questions that they should be asking next that they haven't even gotten that far about. So by proactively guiding them along the journey and anticipating what they want to know next, but they haven't even quite articulated yet, you provide an incredible amount of value. And to the extent that you can productize this, and the extent that you can build a process around this and deliver this through your events, through your educational events, where you're educating and building trust in a one-to-many fashion, either in person, virtually, or both, that can make an enormous difference in generating demand for colocation, cloud services, and network connectivity. Because in all 3 of those categories, there for sure are already companies that are facing extreme levels of commoditization pricing pressure, where it's increasingly really, really difficult to differentiate, stand out from the crowd, and be able to command respect, be able to command margins, being able to get the truth about what's really going on inside of these companies. And your best way in most cases, is having a strong company brand, having a strong professional brand, having your internal subject matter experts be perceived less by their traditional AE, SDR, BDR, AM kind of job titles, and a lot more like consultants, experts, and trusted advisors. This is the most important investment that you should be making to generate demand going forward. Now, I know in data centers, digital infrastructure, and critical facilities, people love going to conferences. And conferences can be valuable with a caveat. Is I want you to very closely evaluate the demographics of that particular conference's attendees last year and what they forecast it to be this year. Put that on the left-hand side of your monitor. And on the right-hand side of your screen, I want you to place your ideal client profile. And I want you to figure out, based on their stated demographics last year and their projected demographics for this year's event, how good of a match you have with their demographics against your ideal client profile. If it's a fantastic match, keep going. If it's a terrible match, if you're looking for a needle in a haystack, well, I shouldn't have to tell you this, but you may want to put the brakes on that particular event, or at least look at the bottom 20% of your event investments from last year and figure out where it makes sense to continue and where it makes sense to pump the brakes, and perhaps pivot those investments into hosting your own educational events in person and virtually, where you can cherry pick the heck out of who gets invited in the first place, who gets attended. So you, instead of having a 90% loss factor on persona mismatch with a massive conference, you get a 90% matching factor where 9 out of 10 people, 18 out of 20 people, 180 out of the 200 people that are in the room line up perfectly or nearly perfectly with your ideal client profile. Thing number 2 to also be aware of with big national, big global conferences, as opposed to hosting your own events, it's incredibly important that we don't just get access to the right people, but we're able to educate and build trust with those folks. Now, at a typical major data center conference, for argument's sake, that has 2,500 attendees, there are 2%, there are typically 50 people, maybe 4%, maybe 100 people that are attending that conference that get to educate and build trust. Those are the speakers. And by extension, the speakers typically bring along a couple people from their team. So it's possible out of the 2,500 people that are attending that there's 50 or 75 or 100 people speaking, and there's another 150 or 200 that are attached to the speakers. They work with the speakers. So maybe 10% of the conference is getting to educate and build trust. The other 90%, what do you think you're doing? Learning? Lots of ways to learn, right? Following? Maybe you're the product. Does the conference even exist if you're not there? Is there a reason for people to provide free public speaking or to pay to exhibit at booths if you're not there as the product that's being sold? In the booths, can some of the education and trust building happening? It can, but can you really hold people's attention for more than a couple of minutes before they're wandering off to the next other 99 booths or other 49 booths that are there? Aside from the noise, aside from the ADD, aside from their attention being all over the place, we know increasingly a lot of the conferences, if you want the great open bar, it's in the exhibit hall, right? So it speaks volumes about where we are with a lot of this. Again, some of these conferences, a lot of these conferences can provide good value if they line up perfectly with your ideal client profile and you have an organic speaking slot where you're able to educate and build trust. If it doesn't line up perfectly, if you don't have an organic speaking slot, before you worry about the next 10 conferences, the next 7-figure, 8-figure conference investment, I would give serious thought to going back to making sure that you're providing extremely strong surface area coverage on your ideal client profile, on your most important buyer personas, especially for your large deals, in a way where you're actually able to educate and build trust with the right people in the right places at the right time. And most of all, in the right context, where you know at your own events, you know it's the right people. You know they're from the right companies. You know they're from the right roles. And most of all, you're not competing with 49 other speakers, 99 other speakers, 99 other exhibitors, just to be able to get them to focus on what you're talking about for a few minutes. So when it comes to colocation, cloud services, and network connectivity and generating demand, I'm very, very bullish on hosting your own educational events in person, virtually, on demand, as a way to drive alignment with multiple stakeholders from the same company while they're in their formative stages of researching and comparing options and evaluating pricing, where you have time to stack the decks in your favor and shape the criteria that they use to evaluate all of the different colocation, cloud services, and network connectivity options that are in front of them. If you're not able to get in early, if you're not able to get in often, and you're only getting in the conversation at the absolute tail end, which is sometimes what ends up happening at major conferences, it's really difficult to change their mind because someone else already got in there early and often and stacked the decks in their favor. They owned the professional development. They owned the learning and development. They owned all the differentiation and competitive positioning and thought leadership. And that is a really, really powerful engine going forward for a company like yours that wants to be able to scale and grow profitably. Remember, teams that learn together grow together. Proactively drive this alignment to set your sales team up for success, to set your account managers up for success, and to lay the groundwork for those clients, those channel partners, becoming your long-term advocates who love working with your company and wouldn't dream of going anywhere else for their colocation, cloud services, and network connectivity. So that's how a colocation, cloud services, and network connectivity company can generate demand. Next question up, what are we going to address this week? So far we've been talking about data center operators and a little bit about data center technology, digital infrastructure. In the next section, we're going to talk about part of facilities, data center facilities, and in particular, cooling. How do we prevent everything from melting down as the power requirements go nuts as we move into a world where so much is being driven by GPUs and AI and high performance and supercomputing? So with that in mind, how do we grow a data center cooling business in a new regional market? How does a data center cooling business grow in a new regional market? So what this question implies is that you have an established business that's already had a lot of success in other regional markets, and you're now moving into a new regional market. So my bigger question is, what has worked so far? When we look at the regional markets where you've had success in the past, what do we know about your happiest clients, your most profitable clients, your longest term clients that stay with you for years and expand and become powerful promoters, love to sing your praises about how wonderful your products, your technology, your services, and your team members are? So with that in mind, that should help you figure out where they're located, how big or small they are there certain industries, certain business models, certain niches that are a better fit than others? When it comes to data center cooling, there's definitely a geographic component to it that's especially relevant, because cooling by definition means you're providing cooling equipment, whether it's chillers, whether it's vats, liquid cooling, direct to chip. These, for sure, there are products and services that need to be manufactured and shipped and installed as part of commissioning and serviced and delivered and serviced and provide training for the facilities managers. All of that needs to happen for the most part face to face. So there's definitely some geographic coverage areas that need to be addressed as to whether you can ship your cooling products, install, service on an ongoing basis. For a lot of companies, they'll choose to have their own engineers, their own facilities folks, their own consultants involved in delivering, installing, first cousin of like HVAC with all this. For others, they're the manufacturer and they recruit companies that take care of the commissioning, installation, ongoing service and support with all of this. But yeah, definitely having regional presence is incredibly important with all this. So to go into a regional market, my question is, why do you think this particular regional market is different? And it's very possible it is different. Like, for example, let's say you've had great success in the United States and Canada with your cooling business, and you're moving into Latin America. For sure, at the risk of stating the obvious, you're going to need marketing and sales enablement materials and staff that's bilingual, possibly trilingual. You're not going to get very far in selling into a lot of the markets competitively in Latin America if all of your staff and all of your collateral, all of your email marketing, your social posts, your website content, all of that is only in English. So for sure, there's localization issues that come up. Second, we need to know what particular regional market you're entering. Like, for example, in Latin America and Brazil, got to have content and team members who can educate and build trust in Portuguese, right? Not just English. Through most of the rest of South America, it's likely going to be Spanish. So there's definitely issues that come up with how you're figuring out your ICP, your ideal client profile, how you're doing your buyer persona research. But it's even more than that. Like, for example, in certain markets, you may be used to selling to mid-market and enterprise clients. And then you enter another geographic market and you discover that there really aren't that many enterprise clients, and you're primarily selling to small and mid-market. So in other words, all of a sudden, you're figuring out a way for your cooling solutions to try to come up with a more entry-level solution than what you're used to selling in the US and Canada, because there just simply aren't enough enterprise clients. And your biggest clients in that particular market may be more mid-market, but there's a lot of demand potentially among thousands or at least hundreds of more small businessy kind of companies, where instead of there being 200 to 500 or 200 to 1,000 employees, maybe these companies have 50 to 500 employees or something like that. So you're trying to figure out a way, in much the same way that IT OEMs going back decades have tried to figure out a way to have different product lines for different segments of the market, depending on company size. This is no different. You're trying to figure out, do you want to play in a space where you're going to tap out and saturate market share wise pretty quickly on the enterprise clients where you've been most successful? There's fewer mid-market clients, but there's a ton of smaller clients. So in cooling, that may not necessarily be the case for you in this particular example, but just this is the basic idea. As we're trying to figure out, when it comes to entering a new regional market, it's not just about marketing. It's not just about sales. It's very possible there's some product management roadmap issues that come up with entering into this new market. For sure, there's potentially regulation issues. There's potentially different issues with packaging and shipping and compliance and how it integrates with other facilities related investments that they have in that region, knowing who the predominant players are. Again, these shouldn't be a big surprise to you, because this is what your product managers, your product management team is spending a lot of time on when you decide to enter a new market. But when you're looking to grow in that new market, essentially you're using a lot of the same playbook that you would use in your primary markets. It's a matter of getting the right people in the right places at the right time, and most of all in the right context, to see you and your client-facing team members as the be-all end-all experts when it comes to anything and everything having to do with data center cooling. So we figure out the company sizes, as we were just talking about a few moments ago. We've talked about the geographic sizes. And then depending on how expansive your cooling products are and how big or small their companies are, you may need a few different kinds of buyer personas, a few different segments that you'll be looking to educate and build trust with in these particular markets. And once you've determined who the stakeholders are that matter most in these companies, we need to rank them by who's going to have the biggest economic impact on shaping how they research and compare options and evaluate pricing and ultimately make the purchase decision. And once you've ranked those, then we need to do our homework on what's going on in that person's world. What are they trying to achieve? What are their biggest goals? And what's driving them nuts? What's frustrating the heck out of them to no end? Once we understand that and we've documented that in your buyer personas, then we're able to build our content calendar. We're able to build our event calendar. And most of all, we do this not just for the primary segment. We do this for the secondary segment. There may even be tertiary segments. A lot of times for companies in cooling, a secondary or tertiary segment is like a channel partner, a integrator, a facilities integrator, a consultancy that specializes in power, cooling, sustainability, efficiency. Once you have that in mind, once you've defined all that, then and only then should you start working on the copywriting for your website for that particular regional market. What? You already built the website without doing the research? We need to make sure that as you're entering this new regional market, that what goes on your website pages, what goes on your landing pages, what goes in your email marketing, what goes on your social posts, what goes in your event strategy, what goes in your videos, all of this should be grounded in what is top of mind for the most important stakeholders in these kinds of companies. If you've built all of these materials and you did not first do the research, I got some bad news for you. No, good news and bad news. The good news is it's totally fixable. The bad news is you probably did some work that needs to be redone to sharpen your focus on what's actually really going on in this new regional market. So once you have that, you're in a good place to build out your website. More than likely, you're going to want a separate site or a separate part of your website just for this particular region. More than likely, you're going to want separate social media because, again, going back to the example of Latin America, just putting out LinkedIn posts and YouTube videos in English probably isn't going to cut it in that particular market. You're almost certainly going to need a separate set of social media profiles in Spanish. You're going to need a separate set of social media profiles in Portuguese. And it's not just a matter of directly translating. It's a matter of understanding what the segmentation strategy is, who those ideal clients are, doing your homework and figuring out what their goals and challenges are that may only slightly overlap with the goals and challenges in your primary markets, assuming your primary market was US and Canada. So once you figure all of that out, that's the best way to lay the foundation for growing, is getting crystal clear on who those ideal clients are, understanding who the stakeholders are within those accounts, and figure out a way for you to educate and build trust with as many of the right people in those right accounts as possible. From the ideal client profile, you'll build out a target account list. You may have a separate target account list for each country within that regional market, if that's how you are segmenting up your sales team, or adjust accordingly, depending on how you're divvying up your accounts, depending on how you're divvying up your territories. But you end up with the target account list, and then you're building all of the collateral. You're building all the lead generation campaigns. You're building all the sales enablement templates. You're building all of the decks. At the end of the day, it's super important to support your client-facing team members in getting in as early as possible in that journey, so that those stakeholders see your client-facing team members as experts on data center cooling for this particular company in this particular region, roughly this company size, roughly of this kind of stakeholder in this kind of company. And the more highly specific that expertise is, the easier of a time your client-facing team members are going to have with attracting, engaging, and building trust with the most important stakeholders in these companies. If you have the luxury of a significant percentage of the target accounts being in close proximity to where you have physical presence in that market, for sure, host events in your own facilities. In addition to that, regardless of whether you have physical presence or not, you need to figure out a way to get in front of as many people in those accounts as possible in a way that gets you out of the vendor box. If you have to settle for showing up as a vendor once in a while, okay, but what I'd really like to see you doing is figuring out all of the associations, all the conferences, all the meetups that your primary and your secondary personas in those markets go to, and then pair that up with your subject matter experts who can deliver amazingly helpful educational content to those stakeholders at those events, and then allow enough lead time and outreach time so you can get in touch with the conference producers, the chapter presidents of these local groups, and offer up your subject matter experts to come in and give a talk for a half hour, 45 minutes, and answer some questions about. And again, this can't be about your products. This isn't a demo. This is about understanding the biggest goals and challenges that each segment, each persona is facing in this local market, and pairing that up with someone from your team that has deep enough expertise that they can add a ton of professional development, learning development value for those individual stakeholders. It's incredibly important that they're seen as experts, not just a vendor. If this can happen in your own facility with very targeted invitations to your target accounts, great. If you supplement that with visiting other people's events in a way where you're not just buying a booth, but you're actually providing speakers expertise that's educating and building trust at that event, that's what I recommend that you focus on. In addition to that, you can take the exact same slides, the exact same curricula that you would deliver in person, either at your own events or other people's events, and deliver these as webinars, as live streams. And of course, wherever possible, record these, make them available on demand, repurpose them. So if someone wants to watch the full 35 or 40-minute talk, great. If there's 6 different sections, well, you have 6 short form videos, maybe a dozen or 2 different snackable moments in YouTube shorts or vertical videos or something like that. You can repurpose into LinkedIn documents, infographics, blog posts, email marketing, short form social posts, a host of different ways. But at the end of the day, our goal is to educate and build trust with the right people in the right places at the right time, and most of all, in the right context. So in this new regional market, the most important stakeholders see your client-facing team members as the go-to experts when it comes to anything and everything to do with data center cooling for their particular companies. So that is what I'd recommend for growing a data center cooling business in a new regional market. We have 3 more questions that we'll be tackling in this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show. But before we do that, we'll take a real quick break for a message from our sponsor. If you're getting good value from this week's show, make sure that you hit the like button to help spread the word.
The Data Center Go-to-Market podcast is sponsored by DCSMI, elevating the role of sales, marketing, and go-to-market GTM professionals in the growth of the data center industry. To stay informed about upcoming episodes, make sure that you subscribe to the Data Center Sales and Marketing newsletter on the DCSMI website that can be found at www.dcsmi.com. Again, that URL is www.dcsmi.com.
Hey, Joshua Feinberg here from DCSMI, the Data Center Sales and Marketing Institute. We are all about elevating the role of sales, marketing, and go-to-market professionals in the growth of the data center industry. If you have an idea for a topic or a question or a challenge that you'd like to see us address in an upcoming episode, an upcoming show, be sure to leave that in the comments on whatever platform that you're watching, and we'll add that to the queue of potential topics to consider for upcoming shows just like this. So what's up next? What's the next question that we're going to be addressing this week? Next up, we're going to turn our attention to the data center construction, real estate, and investment part of the data center ecosystem. And in particular, we're going to talk about how a data center general contractor generates customers for future project scope. How does a data center GC, general contractor, generate customers for future project scope? That is a fantastic question. And what it largely depends on is how big or small your company is and how big or small their company is. What do I mean by that? Generally, smaller general contractors tend to work on smaller projects, and national, much larger general contractors tend to work on larger projects. So when it comes to generating customers for future project scopes, we need to get some self-awareness about, from a competitive standpoint, in the regional markets where you do business or in the national markets where you do business, where do you fit? Where do you stack up? Are you considered one of the big guys, or are you considered a small regional, small local kind of construction company, general contractor specializing in data centers and industrial construction, mission critical facilities kinds of construction? So what that's going to help us do is we're going to figure out basically where you've been most successful. If we look at your past projects, some of them may be described in the case study section on your website. Some of them may be sitting as logos on your website. At the minimum, you should be able to go into your customer relationship management system, sit down with your leadership team, sit down with your finance execs, and get a handle on where you've been most successful in the past. How big or small are these clients? Where they tend to be located? Are they colo facilities? Are they enterprise data centers? Are they hyperscale facilities? Are they edge facilities? Maybe you're building modular facilities, which is more like manufacturing, like prefab, than traditional data center construction. But where have you, as long as your company is not a startup, you presumably have some track record, and where you've been most successful, where you've gotten a product market fit and go to market fit. What do we know about who your best clients are that have gotten the most value, that have loved working with you, that have been profitable, where you've built strong references, all that stuff. For determining where you're going to get your next clients like that, that's incredibly important, because that's going to help figure out who are the companies where we need to be building relationships with? Where do we need to get a foot in the door with? Because if you, for example, have determined that most of your most profitable clients are colocation operators, and you don't do well with enterprise data centers, and you've never had a hyperscale project, then we're looking for you to build relationships with colocation operators and data center developers and venture capital, private equity firms that have portfolio companies that are in and around colocation. Conversely, if you've done terrible in colocation, if you've had miserable success with hyperscalers, and you've only done well with enterprise data centers, or you've only done well with edge, well, that again will shape how you define your ideal client profile and how you build out your target account list. In other words, are there a couple hundred potential clients? Are there a couple dozen potential clients for each of your regional markets that you do business within? It's very likely that there's only a couple dozen potential companies that you can do business with directly as the general contractor who's overseeing all of this. And because it's a smaller list of target accounts, by nature, you're able to have the luxury of like what a hyperscale revenue director would have. In other words, because these are such large deals, albeit they may be in some cases low margin deals, you can afford to invest a considerable amount of resources in educating and building trust with the right folks from the right companies. And over time, based on what you've discovered with your most successful clients, you'll figure out, based on the size of their company and the kinds of stakeholders within those companies that tend to show up. If you're selling to small to mid-size colocation operators, you're almost certainly interacting with a CEO, a CFO, head of construction, probably board members for a small to mid-size colocation operator. If you're selling to a hyperscaler, you're getting nowhere near those in most cases, unless you're selling massively large facilities. You're probably tapping out at like a chief construction, vice president of construction, or something like that. You'll get to know commissioning folks, you'll get to know site planners, you'll get to know designers. But again, the roles, how granular your segmentation strategy is within these accounts, how granular your buyer personas need to be in these particular accounts will depend a ton based on how big or small their companies are. If their companies are relatively small, you need to, by definition, be dealing with C-level executives. If you're selling to enterprises, in many cases, you're probably not getting quite to that level, and unless these are huge projects and huge facilities. And again, like your company size, their company size will shine a very different light on how you deal with segmentation. A lot of companies too that are general contractors, because it's so closely related to real estate, they're building relationships with brokers in those areas. So if like you're a national general contractor, at some point, there's land involved, right? There's site planners involved. There's the JLLs and the CBREs and like Cushman & Wakefield and Avison Young. All these companies tend to, it depends on where you're located. But yeah, there's a lot of different parts of the ecosystem that can all of a sudden be very, very relevant when it comes to secondary and tertiary kinds of stakeholders with building this future project scope. But yeah, we want to get there as early as possible. Who knows about these projects really, really early on? Well, the money, right? The capital, who's funding all these. So building relationships with data center developers and data center investors certainly get you in much earlier. Site planners know when they're looking around for locations where these facilities would go. So how early do you want to get in? The earlier you get in, the more likely it is that you're controlling a big part of that research and decision-making process. So at the end of the day, depending on the nature of your business model, how big or small they are, and how many different kinds of relationships that you want to build that are integral to getting first mover advantage on these future project scopes, there could potentially be 3, 4, 5 different kinds of stakeholders that are incredibly relevant. Now, it's probably happening a little bit before you're involved, but we're also in an environment too where when it comes to big data center development projects, there's a lot of community stakeholders that are involved now. Elected officials, regulators, utility companies. How far is your construction project going to go if they can't get grid power and there's no reasonable no reasonable plan for behind the meter for alternative kind of energy? So yeah, utility companies play a role. And then in certain geographic markets, not only is it a multi-year wait for grid capacity, you may have community activists to contend with before you ever get to the point of putting the shovel in the ground to be able to start working on land preparation and boring the slab and things like that. So yeah, there's a lot of interrelated issues that come up with generating customers for future project scope. It is definitely not anywhere near as, if you thought it was complicated 5 or 10 years ago, order of magnitude more complicated now. There are 7-8 figure investments to get to the point that you're even getting a project to the point where construction is ready to start. This isn't for the faint of heart anymore. This is why you're seeing increasingly massive consolidation in a lot of the mature markets for data center development. How do you develop this expertise? Well, for the most part, companies that are general contractors, if you're starting out new, it's very, very likely that everyone that's on your executive team was in a leadership role at another company who was also involved in this, either on the contractor side or on the end user side or some other part of, the EPC, some other part of the ecosystem that's incredibly relevant for all of this. Supply chain logistics folks get involved as well at some point. But again, it's like, how early do you want to get in? How much of the projects do you want to control? And what kind of resources are you bringing to the table? All of this helps you generate leads and develop opportunities for future project scope. In most cases, the contractors that I come across are rarely at the highest level. They're typically subcontractors. and they're working under a much larger company than theirs who owns the whole contract. And by the nature of that, you don't really get to talk about the clients. There's massively enforced non-disclosures on all of this. You'll have all these deep relationships, but no one's allowed to know that your company exists as a public separate entity because you're strictly working for the larger general contractor. It's a very, very complex ecosystem. And again, to truly understand it, this, in most cases, just setting up booths at conferences is not going to cut it. Just doing webinars, just hosting your own events isn't going to cut it. You need to do like all of the above and be hiring business developers who bring a deep bench, deep level of expertise from several years or several decades of relationship building where they've educated and built a trust to, in many cases, be able to get the inside scoop weeks, months, potentially even years ahead of these major projects going up. So a lot of the same things that other companies would do throughout the data center ecosystem for generating customers and future project scope are relevant. But because these are such huge deals and there's so many more stakeholders involved, it just by nature of what you're doing, going to need bigger teams, more deeply niched experts, more construction experts, more engineering experts, more design experts, more experts on the legal and on the real estate side. That kind of almost is like lobbyist kind of skill set. All of this comes into play for being successful. So if you're operating in the construction, real estate, and investment part of the data center ecosystem as a data center general contractor, and you want to generate customers for future project scope, be prepared to build that brand, be prepared to figure out a way to get in as early as possible in these projects. And when you think you're getting in early, keep digging and digging and digging layers and layers and layers back, because chances are there's a competitor of yours who's getting in even earlier. So that's the name of the game with all of this, is doing everything possible to be the earliest one in, to get the inside scoop on what's coming next, an edge, competitive edge for knowing exactly what needs to be done to know what customers are coming, what future project scopes are coming. Generally, it's not weeks, it's usually months, in some cases even years ahead of the stage where the construction work is actually going to begin. So that's how a data center general contractor can generate customers for future project scopes. Don't underestimate the complexity. Don't underestimate how many different kind of categories of stakeholders are involved and how multidisciplinary this approach needs to be, both on your side and with the different kinds of stakeholders that are involved in these huge deals externally. Next question, what do we got? So how does a data center efficiency, reliability, and sustainability firm sell solutions and optimize costs? How does a company that's providing professional services around efficiency, reliability, and sustainability sell solutions and optimize their costs? So you're operating within the facilities part of the data center ecosystem. You're not a technology company. You're not a data center operator. You're not in construction, real estate, or investment. You're providing facilities related services to a facility that's either in the process of being commissioned or is already up and running. And they're trying to get better at data center efficiency, data center reliability, and data center sustainability. And you're trying to figure out how you can sell your solutions and how you can optimize costs. So optimizing costs is something where you're more than likely going to need to have a similar kind of conversation for someone that brings my expertise, but is on the finance side. So this is a logistics and supply chain. This is a procurement. This is a processes. This is a sourcing problem. And most of all, it wraps up into a finance related challenge. So I'm going to focus on the sales part, on the marketing and the sales part. So for a company like yours that's focused on efficiency, reliability, and sustainability, to develop your go-to-market, develop your marketing and sales playbook, we need to understand where you've been most successful with these kinds of engagements in the past. In other words, as long as your company is established and you're well past the point where you have product market fit and you've long achieved go-to-market fit, as you deploy more marketing and sales capital into your company, that you're going to continue to get predictable results. You may even have channel partners, companies, referral partners that you do some kind of revenue share or commission or some kind of finder's fee for helping to bring you deals for data center clients that need help with efficiency, reliability, and sustainability. Not quite as popular as in the data center operator space or in the data center technology space, but usually for efficiency, reliability, and sustainability, you're dealing with like facilities managers, sustainability, ESG. In some cases, in smaller facilities, maybe it's just a data center manager. And really small facilities, like a colocation operator with a couple dozen employees or 50 or 100 employees or something like that, you're probably already dealing with like the C-level execs in that company, just because of the nature of how big your engagement is relative to the overall size of that company. When you're talking about efficiency, you could be dealing with engineers in those facilities as well. So for the marketing and sales of solutions, it sounds like you already have productized solutions. In other words, you're, rather than going in and doing a diagnostic and scoping this out and building something completely from scratch, it sounds like you already know, when you're talking about selling a solution, that there's some kind of engagement or some kind of basic templated framework that you use for these kinds of engagements. And with that in mind, you likely over time have developed a pretty good sense of what companies, whether they're colocation operators, hyperscale providers, enterprise data centers, or perhaps all the above, how big do their companies need to be to afford your minimums? And at what point do they get so large that your company may not have the resources to handle an enterprise that large? So for this kind, depending on what your company size is, depending on their company sizes and your sweet spot, let's say for argument's sake that you're selling efficiency, reliability, and sustainability programs for data center operators that have the low end, at least 50 employees up to as much as like 5,000 employees. There's a certain, in addition to size, for the most part, because you're dealing in data center facilities with efficiency, reliability, and sustainability, you're going to need to have local presence in those markets. So geographically, you'll define like where you have physical presence, where you are comfortable traveling to, where you potentially have consultants or vendors, channel partners that could potentially bridge the gap on providing some of these localized site visits, site surveys, speccing out, installation, ongoing support of these engagements. So there's a geographic part, there's a size part, and then depending on how big or small these companies are, you may have very granular persona strategy of many different kinds of segments, 3, 4, 5 different segments that you're catering to. Or if they're smaller companies, it may just be 1 or 2 segments. Maybe there's a facilities manager and the CEO or the COO or something like that, or director of operations. So with all of this in mind, or director of facilities or director of engineering, each company is going to define this a little different. If there's someone who's in charge of ESG when it comes to efficiency, reliability, and sustainability, more than likely that person is going to own the engagement, depending on the internal politics, how the org chart is organized. But at the end of the day, there's for sure people in that organization that care about efficiency, reliability, and sustainability. Otherwise, they wouldn't have done the research that helps them land on your website, on your social media, on your podcast, on your videos, on your webinars, on your events. Along the same lines, if they didn't land in those places and you're doing outbound to them, you're trying to figure out like, gee, we understand what the account looks like. We understand who this particular stakeholder is. We've done their homework and we've figured out what their biggest goals are in their own words when it comes to sustainability, reliability, and efficiency. We've figured out where they're struggling with the most, and we've put together some helpful educational resources, some helpful educational events that someone in this particular job role, in this particular company, which should be supremely interested in, because we've compiled best practices that can help them do their job better to achieve their goals around efficiency, reliability, and sustainability, and address some of the biggest stressors, the things that are driving them nuts right now about efficiency, reliability, and sustainability. And we're doing this on a segment by segment basis, because we know that someone that's in an ESG role, environmental, sustainability, governance, in a particular company will have a much deeper interest in this, a much more detailed interest in this than someone that's just a facilities manager, where they're dealing with those 3 topics in addition to 20 other responsibilities that they're juggling because they're in a relatively small company. So from that, we should be able to build an educational event strategy, educational resources, and whether we're delivering these as in-person events that we host, speaking at other people's events as a keynote or breakout speaker, or moderating a panel or hosting your own webinars. At the end of the day, we need to educate and build trust with these folks about anything and everything that's directly related to data center efficiency, reliability, and sustainability. And the better job with that, the more we earn our way in early and often, the more we're likely to be not only building significant mind share with this particular stakeholder, but the more likely it is that the stakeholder now trusts us enough that they're willing to introduce us to their peers, their boss, the rest of the decision committee who's working on figuring out the answers to some of their biggest efficiency, reliability, and sustainability challenges and goals that they're up against in their particular company. So that's basically the marketing and the sales playbook, is we need to get in there as early as possible and as often as possible, so they're motivated to spend a lot of those 28 touch points between complete stranger and purchase decision with your client-facing team members. And most of all, we get you out of the vendor box so they see your deep expertise and they're motivated to want to keep coming back and keep learning from you and your client-facing experts. That's incredibly important. In a self-driven buyer's journey, the only way that we're going to get you out of the vendor box is for your prospects and clients to see your client-facing team members, your account managers, your account executives, your sales developers, your business developers, your marketers, your product folks, your channel partner managers. They need to be seen as the go-to experts when it comes to anything and everything for this particular company having to do with their efficiency, their scalability, their reliability, their sustainability. The better job we can do with all this, the more we keep getting invited in. The less good a job that we do with this, the more likely it is that we're either ignored or we're going to be seen as a commoditized vendor where the only card left that we have to play is competing on price. We don't want you competing on price. We don't want you to be commoditized. We need you to be differentiated, and we need for it to not just be a differentiated solutions offering. We need to be differentiated throughout the full journey. So we need to understand what is the leading indicator, what is the leading indicator goal, the leading indicator challenge that's going to lead someone in the coming weeks or coming months to recognize that they need help with data center efficiency, data center reliability, and data center sustainability. And the better job you can do with getting those deep customer insights and proactively delivering high value educational content, educational resources, educational events experience, the more likely it is that you're able to influence multiple stakeholders from the same company in their formative stages, in the awareness and the consideration stages, where you have a chance to stack the purchase criteria that they use to evaluate all of the different options in front of them. This gets you onto the short list. It keeps you on the short list. And when you do a fantastic job with this, it starts to knock your competitors off of the short list. So by the time they're ready for a sales conversation, the goal is to be to the point where your company is the last person standing, the last option standing on the short list, where you've basically won. It's your deal now, because you've stacked the decks in the favor so strongly that they've seen that your company is just the obvious choice when it comes to anything and everything having to do with data center efficiency, reliability, and sustainability. So that's how to market. That's how to sell the solutions to stack the decks in your favor. Again, there was a question here around cost optimization as well. When you execute the go-to-market, when you execute the marketing and sales enablement and the event marketing the right way, you're for sure going to optimize your client acquisition costs. What's often known as unit economics, or CAC, client acquisition cost, or cost of client acquisition. You'll optimize those costs. In terms of the actual service delivery, again, that's a better conversation to have with your product managers, your project managers, and your finance executives to understand your true costs of delivering those engagements and optimizing those costs as well. The value that I can add is to help you get super focused on who these companies are and who these individuals are within these companies. Because when you're selling the same kind of solutions, the same kind of engagement repeatedly to the same kind of company, you develop a lot of efficiencies to be able to do this cost effectively. When you're all over the place and you're selling to 20 different kinds of companies, all over the place geographically, all over the place size-wise, all over the place in terms of their business model or industry, it's really hard to develop a repeatable process that works across the board, and you constantly subject to customizations and change orders, and that's what screws with your margins. So the better job you can do with figuring out where you do best that ideal client profile, and the better job you can do with developing that account list and developing a pipeline of qualified leads, qualified opportunities that lines up exceptionally well with that ideal client profile, that for sure will help with optimizing costs. But in terms of what happens post-purchase, what happens during the actual engagement and the services delivery. Yeah, this is applying a similar kind of methodology that I'm talking about here, but bring in your project managers, bring in your service delivery managers, bring in your finance folks to figure out what your actual soft and hard costs are of delivering that kind of engagement and figuring out where there's opportunities to fine tune what you're doing with marketing and sales enablement, your whole sales process that helps you to get a consistent flow of clients that are going to be the most lucrative for your company. So that's how I would approach how a data center efficiency, reliability, and sustainability firm in the facilities part of the data center ecosystem can sell solutions and optimize costs. If you've been getting good value from this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show, make sure you help spread the word and hit the like button. If you have an idea for a topic or a question or a challenge that you'd like to see us address in an upcoming show, be sure to leave that in the comments on whatever platform that you're watching. That brings us to our final question for this week's show. What do we got? So our final question for this week brings us back to the data center technology part and data center operator parts of the data center ecosystem. And the question is, how do we grow a data center infrastructure and cloud solutions business? How do we grow a data center infrastructure and cloud solutions business? So we need to know, for starters, are all of our clients going to be buying data center infrastructure and cloud solutions from our company? Or do we offer these options a la carte, or basically customize the deals, customize the proposals, customize the quotes, depending on what they want? Are we going to allow clients to just buy one or the other? Are we comfortable selling cloud solutions a la carte? Are we comfortable selling infrastructure a la carte? Or do we need to be able to have profitable client engagements, need to be able to sell infrastructure and cloud solutions to both? If we need to be able to sell both of those services to the same clients, then we have a much simpler go-to-market sales and marketing plan. And as long as that's the case, we're looking to see where you've been most successful in the past. If we look at your case studies, we look at your reviews, look at your testimonials, look at your logos, we look in your customer relationship management system, we talk to your CFO, who are the happiest clients, who are the most successful clients, who lands and expands, who has a great experience with onboarding, who loves coming to your customer-only events, who loves being able to bring their friends to their customer-only events because they're getting so much value from you, who's with you for years, who's always willing to sing your praises, and your staff just simply adores working with them because it's a fantastic company, a fantastic culture, and all around exactly the kind of client that you'd love to copy and paste and clone a couple dozen times or a couple hundred times. So how do we grow our data center infrastructure and cloud solutions business in that way? So once we know that, we should be able to document what makes those favorite clients that love us and that we love, conversely, what defines them? Where do they tend to be located geographically? How big or how small are their companies, and what industries, what niches, what business models do they tend to be located in? All three of those parameters matter a lot. Here's why. For cloud solutions, that can typically be delivered virtually. Like, for example, if you are buying public cloud from one of the hyperscalers, you don't really get to pick the exact location where your data lives within Azure or within AWS or within Google Cloud, right? It's regional. And you have a rough idea of where it's going to be able to optimize for availability, but you can't go visit that data center. Well, at least most clients can't go visit that data center unless they're exceptionally large enterprise kind of clients and have a special arrangement with the hyperscalers. So you can sell, and by definition, you likely need to sell public cloud virtually. When it comes to data center infrastructure, like a colocation operator that also is offering hybrid cloud, public cloud, private cloud, multi-cloud kind of hookups that's direct connected through the data center infrastructure, something similar to that, there's for sure going to be a proximity-based part of your go-to-market playbook, of your marketing and sales playbook. What does proximity mean? Well, if we go back not only like several years, but even currently, there still continues to be extreme proximity preference among colocation buyers for where the facilities are located. In other words, they want facilities to be located within a couple of miles or a couple of kilometers of where their office is or where their home is, so they can get there fast, so their team members can get there fast on a regular basis when there's a need to. So like, here we are decades later and server hugging is still a thing, right? So with that in mind, for growing that kind of business, that for sure impacts how you define the geographic part of your ideal client profile, right? In addition to that, you're also going to find that there are clients that are located way outside your local area, but need to have a presence where you have a presence, either for governance reasons or for latency reasons. So what that means is that part of your segment, that part of your client list, your prospect list, will need a playbook where you're basically running digital marketing and virtual selling long distance, because it's not practical for those folks to come visit your facility on a regular basis. They may come once, twice, or something like that during the due diligence or evaluation process, but it's not practical for them to come to a monthly lunch and learn series in the classroom or conference room in your co-location facility. It's not. So what's the next best thing you can do? This. Virtual events, webinars, live streams. Will everyone be able to attend all of those? Probably not. Should you record those for the people that would love to have been there but couldn't? Absolutely. Should you make them available on demand? Absolutely. Does that also provide you with an extremely important framework for one person from the company events? One person from a particular target account attends, but like, oh, wow, my network engineer and my CTO, they should have attended as well. Is there a recording I can forward to them? To them. So this is where the recordings of whether it's an in-person event or a virtual event become incredibly important, because for the most part, when it comes to data center infrastructure and cloud solutions, sometimes they're impulse purchases. If there's an outage or there's something that's extremely timely that's happening, usually they're considered purchases. And in the case of co-location, it can be a long-term considered purchase because a company really wants to leave their co-location operator that they currently have because they're not getting what they want, but they're like in month 18 of a 36-month contract. So they got a while before they can exit, unless the pain gets so severe that they're looking for a way to break that contract or pay some financial penalties and get out early, because the cost of the reliability issues, security issues, whatever it is, operational issues, just isn't worth whatever the financial cost is in breaking and early termination with all of that. So there's a geographic portion to it. There's company size that come into play. Like, for example, for data center infrastructure and cloud solutions, can you really sell and service to all different size companies? Or do you do best when they're at a certain company size range? In other words, you know what your minimums are. Do you want your sales team to be spending time selling to pre-revenue, startup-y kind of companies with very limited resources, where there's maybe 5 or 10 employees? Or in order for that client to hit your minimums, they need to be at least at like a 50-person company. Along the same lines, you also know that it's great to have some mid-market clients. It's great to have some smaller enterprise clients, but really, really large enterprise clients, like Fortune 500 clients, may be overwhelming for your company, may be overwhelming for your facility. So maybe you decide for your data center infrastructure and cloud solutions that the perfect ideal client has somewhere between 500 and 5,000 employees, or 500 and 1,000 employees, or something like that. And there may be certain industries that are a better fit than others, because when it comes to data center infrastructure and cloud solutions, depending on where you're located, there may very well be some compliance issues, certification issues, accreditation issues that come up depending on not only where they're located, but what particular industry they're located in. Government, education, healthcare, finance, manufacturing, e-commerce. A lot of those verticals have very specific compliance and certification requirements depending on the region where you're located. So in your ideal client profile, there's a geographic part, there's a company size part, there's definitely an industry part for what's a good fit, and an industry part for where you're going to get knocked out really early. So we need to know those as well, because that dictates what you do with exclusions when it comes to outbound or ad campaigns, or drop-down lists, or filtering, or lists that are in your CRM for determining what's qualified or what's not qualified. So that defines your ideal clients. From your ideal client profile, you'll be able to build a target account list, probably a few hundred for this kind of business, a few hundred potential accounts. It can be a few thousand, depending on how big of a metro area you're in, or whether you have multiple facilities and selling nationally, potentially globally. If you're in the middle of nowhere, maybe it's a couple dozen accounts that are the perfect size that you really want to do business with. Usually for this kind of business and most primary and secondary, tertiary markets, usually it's a few hundred target accounts. And then within those accounts, who are the stakeholders that matter most that we need to build relationships with? And that's going to vary quite a bit depending on your company size and their company size. Selling to enterprises, you have different kinds of stakeholders than selling to a small business where you're more than likely dealing directly with the CTO or VP of IT or something like that on a long-term contract for data center infrastructure and cloud solutions. So again, know your target size, know their company size, and know how granular your segmentation strategy, know how granular your personas are. Once you've figured out who the 2 or 3 most important kind of stakeholders are that you want to build relationships with for data center infrastructure and cloud solutions companies, then we'll prioritize those and rank them: the most important, second most important, third most important, a primary, a secondary, a tertiary. And within each of those, we need to do some homework. We need to do some research to find out what's going on in their world that we could potentially help them with. That's a leading indicator of someone needing data center infrastructure and cloud solutions. Once we know that in their own words, their biggest goals, their biggest challenges in their own words, then we're in a great shape to be able to create more compelling website copywriting, better lead generation offers, better email marketing, better social posts, better outbound, better ads, better event strategy. But without those insights, you're flying blind. And more than likely, it's ego and opinion that's driving these decisions, when in reality, we need to be doing the opposite. We need to understand for your 2 or 3 most important segments what's going on in their world that you can help them with, that's directly or indirectly related to data center infrastructure and cloud solutions. And the better job you can do with understanding that and showing up early and often, the more likely it is that you're going to get out of the vendor box. You're going to truly differentiate. You're going to avoid being seen as a commoditized provider and instead be seen more as a potential partner for data center infrastructure and cloud solutions, as a trusted advisor, as an expert. And the way this is executed on a tactical basis is it's usually educational resources and educational events. And again, these educational events, if your clients are long distance, are going to be delivered probably by webinars and videos and something similar to that, and a video kind of sales-based process until they're able to actually come in to tour your facility. In some cases, they may be super comfortable buying virtually, and in which case 100% of your marketing and sales process is being run digitally. For most of your clients that are located in immediate proximity to your facility, they're going to come in, they're going to do a tour, but I would tell you that you'll have an even better quality tour if the people that are doing the tours are seeing your team members as experts and educators and trusted advisors, meaning they're coming to your educational event series. And if you have 2 or 3 different buyer personas and you've identified 10 or 12 different topics that they care about, those are your 10 or 12 topics for your 10 or 12 monthly events that you're going to hold over the next 10 or 12 months. In other words, if you have 3 buyer personas and your conference room holds 20 people, what I'd love to see you do is week 1 of the month, primary buyer persona, fill that room with the perfect people from your target accounts. The following week, your secondary buyer persona, fill that room with the perfect people from your target accounts that are coming to learn from your client subject matter experts. And your third persona, your tertiary buyer persona for this kind of business, a lot of times as a channel partner, like a managed service provider, a consultant, a value-added reseller, integrator, something like that. Again, fill that room with 15, 20 people from your target accounts who are coming to learn from your client-facing subject matter experts. 15, 20 minutes before the actual educational event starts, they arrive. There's a little bit of networking. There's breakfast or lunch. You give a fantastic talk that's so good that if they flew across the country or flew across the world to attend, you're highly confident that it would be the best or one of the best sessions at that entire conference, what I call conference grade content. Open it up for Q&A for 10, 15, 20 minutes. Take them on a tour. That's your 90-minute event. Lather, rinse, and repeat. Do that every single month for each of your 2 or 3 most important buyer personas. Make sure the right people are attending. And what you'll notice over time is they're getting so much value that you should start to see multiple people from the same companies coming to your events, which is fantastic because that means you're driving alignment across the decision committee in that particular account. The more people from that company that know you exist and that see your experts as trusted advisors, fantastic things happen with sales cycle acceleration. Fantastic things happen with getting you out of the vendor box, keeping you on the short list, proactively knocking your competitors off of the short list, and setting the stage for it becoming a fantastic future client for your company's data center infrastructure and cloud solutions. A lot of the post-sales problems that client success and account managers have to deal with are created by bad marketing, bad sales, bad expectations management. When you can get in early and you're the one teaching the entire decision committee how they should be navigating all of the critical decision points when it comes to their data center infrastructure and cloud solutions, again, beautiful things happen with setting the stage not only for a great sales process, but great onboarding, great expansion, great long-term retention, and that client becoming not only bigger and bigger and bigger over time with their relationship with your company, but being a strong driver of being a promoter. In other words, strong positive word of mouth, appearing in your panel webinars, appearing in your case studies, and just loving to scream from the rooftops about what great service and support and value that they're getting from your company when it comes to their data center infrastructure and cloud solutions. So that's how I would approach how to grow a data center infrastructure and cloud solutions business in today's self-driven buyer's journey, where your prospects, your clients, especially when it comes to being a data center operator or being in the data center technology business, are increasingly sales allergic. We need to figure out a way for you to get in early and often with the right people in the right places at the right time, and most of all, in the right context. So your most important prospects and clients see your client-facing team members as the go-to experts in your area when it comes to data center infrastructure and cloud solutions. So that's the final question that we'll be addressing in this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show. If you've gotten good value from this week's show, make sure that you help to spread the word, share the love by hitting the like button on whatever platform that you're watching on, and feel free to leave comments, leave reviews. We're always thrilled to see those as well. If you have an idea for a topic or a question or a challenge that you would like to see us address in an upcoming show, be sure to leave that in the comments as well on whatever platform that you're watching. If you want to make sure that you stay in the loop about upcoming educational events and resources just like this, be sure to subscribe to the Data Center Sales and Marketing newsletter from DCSMI. You can sign up for free directly on our website at www.dcsmi.com. That way you get notified direct to your email inbox on Sundays about educational events just like this. I'm Joshua Feinberg from DCSMI, the Data Center Sales and Marketing Institute. I also host the Data Center Go-to-Market podcast. If you and I are not currently connected on LinkedIn, feel free to send me a connect invite, and be sure to mention that you were attending or watching the Data Center Sales and Marketing Q&A show, and I'd be happy to be connected with you on LinkedIn. So we're so glad that you're able to join us for this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show. We wish you, your team, and your company great success in growing your role, your team's impact, and your company's impact within data centers, digital infrastructure, and critical facilities. Look forward to seeing you back again next week. Have a great rest of your week. Take care now.
The Data Center Go-to-Market podcast is sponsored by DCSMI, elevating the role of sales, marketing, and go-to-market GTM professionals in the growth of the data center industry. To stay informed about upcoming episodes, make sure that you subscribe to the Data Center Sales and Marketing newsletter on the DCSMI website that can be found at www.dcsmi.com. Again, that URL is www.dcsmi.com.